Hello and welcome back. This is the week 3 lecture. So today I would like to build on what we were talking about last week with our advanced annotation elements. So we were basically just adding more things to look for, more things to take notes on when we read sources for this class. So really not changing much about the basic process or some of these basic sort of critical reading strategies that we've been talking about that we started with. But last week we mentioned, thesis, intention, audience, these and some other things to look for, think about, and again, take notes on, because these are things that you're going to need to consider and potentially discuss at some future point. You might end up analyzing these sources. You might end up thinking more deeply about certain ideas, certain moves made in the sources. So this just gives you more material. It gives you more to observe, more that might help you sort of arrive at ideas and opinions of your own, and just more that you can do with these sources. So we're kind of continuing in that vein this week, talking more about evidence and more specifically the appeals. So if you took my 101, or if you took a lot of different 101s, you probably learned either directly or indirectly about the appeals. These are very ancient rhetorical strategies. They've been around since ancient Greece, and they really are just strategies or techniques that writers and speakers can use to generate arguments. So these are just good things to keep in mind, things to use, things that you're going to be utilizing yourselves when you're making arguments of your own. But here at the beginning of the semester, as we continue to focus a little bit more on reading other people's arguments, understanding our sources, identifying key things in our sources, these are additional things that we can look for and identify in the sources that we read. And we might even be able to take some inspiration. We might be able to utilize some of this stuff in similar ways to how we see our authors using them throughout these early weeks, and then especially once you guys start doing research of your own. So just more things to look for, more things to take notes on, more things that we can understand, analyze, and discuss. But as we've been saying since the beginning, in order to do that valuable work later, you have to remember and you have to grasp what the source is saying, what the source is doing. And that's why note-taking is so important, the underlining, the highlighting, the asking questions, all of that stuff that we've been doing. Let's make sure that we're continuing to do it. And last week, towards the end of lecture, we talked about a few different types of evidence. And I asked you guys to identify some of the evidence that Surowiecki's using in his TED Talk. We can also think about what he's using in his written text. He uses a lot of the same types of strategies, some of the same types of evidence. He leans very much on expert opinion. He wants to show us that he's done research. He's read a lot about this topic. He mentions authors, in the text. He mentions like a psychiatrist or other social scientists that have done some of these studies, that have done some of the research that he's talking about involving social norms and conventions. So Stanley Milgram and the Harvard professor, right? He mentions these people. He mentions some books, some articles that he's drawing a lot of this information from. And then we see him do something very similar in the TED Talk. He references other people who have written about this topic, other experts. He even includes some of their work in the gift bag or the gift package for audience members. So we've already been thinking a little bit about evidence, so I wanted to start this week with evidence. And let's think about it a little bit more. Let's think more about the specific types. But another thing I wanted to sort of throw in there, we're not going to spend a ton of time on this, but it's worth thinking about as you continue to develop your active and critical reading abilities. There's a couple of different ways that evidence can be presented in a source. So I wanted to kind of run through these quickly because this is another thing to notice and maybe jot down a few notes about. So typically, we talk about evidence being presented or used by authors sort of in three different ways. And the first way is the most direct and the most obvious. An author of a source can, of course, state evidence. They can make a declarative statement. They can just say something, provide a statistic, provide a finding from research, maybe an opinion of theirs grounded in specific examples or something else that they've already discussed, but they can simply state evidence. Whatever that evidence might be, they can put it in the form of a sentence. That sentence makes a clear statement, and we read it, we understand it, maybe we take a note on it, maybe we underline it. If it's a really powerful or clear statement, we might think, hey, I want to really highlight that, I want to remember that statement. Sometimes that's the case. In other cases, the statement might not sound super clear and obvious to us immediately. So we have to do some translation. We have to do some of that work that I've talked about. We have to put the ideas in our own words. We have to restate that statement in our own words. And maybe we have to look up a word. Maybe we have to do a little bit of digging online to fully understand what the statement says. But we can still get to that point. We figure it out, we write down a note, and we have the evidence presented to us in this pretty straightforward, clear way in a statement that we can identify. We might end up quoting it, or if we're putting it into our own words, we might end up paraphrasing it or summarizing it. But it's easy when the authors are simply stating evidence. Those statements are usually fairly easy to work with, even if it does take us a little bit of time to crack the code and figure out exactly what they're saying. So that's one way. They can just state the evidence. The second way is the author can imply some evidence. To imply something means to suggest it. It's not directly expressed, but the author is hinting at it, suggesting it, raising it as a distinct possibility. So when you're dealing with implications, you want to be a little bit more careful because it's not being stated directly. It's not being stated always clearly or in that same straightforward fashion that we saw with the first way. So implications are usually something you can act on. Those implications can usually be spotted. You can usually tell if an author is implying something. So that's fair game. The implications, you can do more with those. You can draw conclusions based on those. You can act as if you're pretty confident that what they are implying is in fact true. But you're going to notice that a lot of sources do this. A lot of sources inform you by implying connections or implying larger meanings or conclusions that they might want you to arrive at, but they're not necessarily going to state it in so many words directly in the text. But they're leading you that way. Maybe the types of evidence that they're using, some of their phrasing, the way they're wording stuff, the way they're choosing to emphasize stuff. Emphasis is really important. Word choice can be really important when we're hunting for implications because they're trying to get you to think something or feel something based on what you're reading, but they also want you to kind of come to it on your own. Again, if they just wanted to tell it to you, they would. They would directly state it. But if they're implying it, they sort of want you to arrive at the conclusion or at that desired endpoint with a little bit of help from them. They're guiding you that way. They're maybe pushing you that way, but they want you to do a lot of the heavy lifting, a lot of the work of actually arriving at that conclusion. But if we're reading closely, we can usually detect implications. And those implications are probably going to matter a lot to us as readers. And then we have the third way. An author of a source can cause the reader to infer evidence. To infer something means to form a probable conclusion based on reasoning, logic, what's in front of you. But what's important to note here is that inferring can really only be done by the reader. Those other two ways are really being done by the author. The author can state something, or the author can imply something. But unlike statements or implications, a text cannot do any inferring. Only a person can. Only the reader can. Right? That's what the reader does. You take the evidence on the page, you take what you're reading, you take your own ability to use rational thought and reason, and you infer. You arrive at a probable conclusion based on what you're seeing, what you're looking at. But that's really on you. That's more active on the part of the reader. That's really up to the reader. Those other two things are being done more by the author. So remember, a text can imply, a text can state, but only the reader can infer. And that's fair game too. You can obviously infer certain things. You should. You should arrive at some inferences. You should be doing some inferring. Just make sure they're based on something real, something solid in the text. As long as you can show us that, you can pursue those inferences as much as you feel you should. So just some things, again, to notice. Is the source directly stating a lot? Is it implying? Or is it putting it on the reader to infer? It might matter, right? To observe those different things, to sort of take notes on them, to think more about them. That stuff could matter later. It could also affect how you feel about the source. We typically, not always, but we typically like direct, clear statements. So normally, students like option 1, when the evidence is just being stated in a straightforward way that we can see, talk about, understand, and then use. But there's a limit to that, right? I mean, think about your own preferences as a reader. You certainly want most of the authors that you read to be pretty clear with you, but we don't like being treated like children. We don't like to feel like we're being told obvious things repetitively. We don't like to make it seem like the reader doesn't trust us to figure some things out for ourselves. So there's kind of a fine line. We like a lot of clear, direct statements, but we usually don't mind some implications. And we might not even mind doing some inferring, because it can get tiresome, again, if the author is just kind of pounding us over the head with obvious statements that we feel like we already know or already understand. Sometimes that can be a negative reading experience. So we like clear statements, but only to an extent. We also like to sometimes arrive at things for ourselves. So, all of that is worth considering when you're sort of forming your own evaluations of your sources, when you're just deciding which ones you like best. I mean, you can do that, right? That's not what we're ultimately doing, but along the way, you'll have your preferences. You'll like certain sources more than others, and it's important to know why. And also, some of this might affect how you view the trustworthiness of the source, the reliability of the source, the quality of the evidence might in part be based on how it's presented. So it's all going to matter to you as the reader. It's going to have some effect on you. So, stuff to take notes on and think about more. Okay, so let's move into the appeals. I suspect that a lot of this will be review for many of us. Like I said before, if you took my 101, this will definitely be review because we talk about this in 101. But it's worth revisiting these concepts even if you have learned about them before, because they're important. First, we're going to be identifying them as readers, and then later, of course, we're going to be utilizing them as writers. So we really need to understand this stuff because ultimately they will be valuable tools for us when we are putting together our research papers. So as I said, appeals are just specific techniques or strategies for making arguments. And writers and speakers have been using these strategies literally since ancient Greece. I mean, we get a lot of these concepts from Aristotle. And he had a lot of different appeals. We only cover some of them. But he made this interesting distinction that we still maintain, even in the modern world, between artistic appeals and inartistic appeals. And he uses those words in a way that might be a little bit different from how a lot of us use them today. He doesn't really mean artistic in the sense of like a really nice painting. He's talking about how these strategies get created or like where they come from. So when he talks about artistic appeals, he's saying that they are created or made by the author or by the speaker. So just like we would create a work of art, we are creating these strategies, these particular types of appeals. We are generating them. They come from our minds, right? They are our own creations. That's what he means by artistic appeals, right? They come from you, the author, or, if we're reading somebody, they come from that author. Then on the other hand, inartistic appeals are already made. They already exist. The author does not generate them themselves. They come from research, usually. They already exist in the world. They've already been made, often by other thinkers, other writers, or researchers. So this is largely in the modern world where research comes in. We're going to find most of our inartistic appeals through research, through the work of others, the stuff that we read, the stuff that we find online. So what we want is a nice balance between artistic appeals that come from us and the inartistic appeals that largely come from our research. And by using both, we're eventually going to make good arguments of our own. But for these next few weeks, we're going to spend more time identifying how other writers, other authors use this stuff in their work. So let's start with the artistic appeals because these are the ones that most of us are already familiar with. So we talk about ethos, pathos, and logos. These are the three most common artistic appeals, the stuff generated by the author or by the speaker, because of course in ancient Greece, and still today to some extent, a lot of arguments are delivered in the form of a speech, public speaking. Not all arguments are written down. Obviously, most of the ones we're dealing with in here are written down, but we just watched an example of a spoken argument, the TED Talk from last week, sort of a modern example of an argumentative speech delivered by somebody who functions as both an author and a speaker, depending on what we're looking at. So let's start with ethos. This one, I think, trips people up a little bit because we're not always quite sure what the word means or how it translates to our modern usage. So ethos is literally the ethical appeal. And I think most of us have heard of ethics, and we've heard the word ethical, but maybe we're not 100% sure what it means. But really, ethics, similar to morality, not the exact same, but the way most people think of those terms is just like right and wrong, values, having good character, that sort of thing. And that is what you should think about with ethos, because ethos is all about the ethics or the credibility of the author. So it's really a question of how much can we trust the author? How much can we rely on the author? So this is very much about how the author presents themselves in the text. So this is an important thing to look for, and you can form a lot of interesting opinions if you're really looking at ethos. And we usually think about this on two levels. So there's kind of two things that you need to do as an author in order to establish a good sort of ethical reputation and credibility that will come through to your audience. Number one, you have to establish goodwill. You have to sort of show that you care about your readers, or at least you have a pretty good attitude towards them. You want what's best for them. You are speaking to them out of some desire to better their circumstances or to inform them of something, teach them something, equip them with the necessary means to make important decisions or perhaps to do things that will benefit them later on. So this can take a lot of different forms, and you're not always directly doing something for them. That's not what it's all about. It's just about showing that you sort of care for them. You have some degree of regard and good feelings for them. And that's important just in terms of like basic human psychology. Generally, audiences don't respond very well to a speaker or author who seems contemptuous of them, who seems to dislike them, have disdain or disgust for them. That's usually a deal breaker, and they're not going to even listen to your argument. So a lot of ethos comes down to tone. It comes down to language. Again, it's how the author is presenting themselves. So a lot of that has to do with how they're saying things, how they're addressing their readers, their tone, their style, and maybe even their vocabulary. So establishing that goodwill, that's part one of having good ethos. Part two is knowledge. And this should be pretty obvious. If you want people to regard you as trustworthy and reliable, you need to demonstrate that you know what you're talking about. This is important for all the authors that we read, no matter what the source is. And it will later be important for us when we become writers. You have to show your audience that you've done your homework. You've read about the topic. You know a fair amount about the topic. And you'll notice how common this is. There's often many ways to do this, but one of the easiest ways, is to simply have good evidence. If you have good inartistic appeals, if you have a lot of expert opinion, like our friend James, if you make it clear that you've read other authors who have written about this, you've done research, you've acquired a fair amount of knowledge, that's always going to be to your benefit. People just naturally are more inclined to listen to you if you can demonstrate a nice degree of knowledge. So the knowledge really does come from research, from reading, from simply you learning a lot about the topic. Whereas the goodwill is really more about how you package and present yourself. But the combination of those things, if you do it well, you'll have credibility. You'll come across as somebody that people can trust, somebody can listen, people can listen to you and believe what you say. That's important. So as a reader, you have to ask yourself, how do you feel about these authors? Are they establishing good credibility? Are they showing goodwill towards their readers? And are they demonstrating knowledge? So that's ethos. We really just think of that as credibility, reliability on the part of the author. And that's really all you have to think of when you think of ethos. Let's go to logos next because it's easy. It's logic. The Greek word sounds a lot like our modern word for logic. We know what logic is, but we're not dealing with formal logic in this class. That's a lot closer to math than it is to English. So when it comes to research and doing this kind of reading, we're really just asking ourselves, do the arguments seem reasonable? Do they seem to possess common sense? We have pretty easy standards. Does it seem probable, possible, reasonable, within the realm of possibilities? And usually, if an argument seems defensible, somewhat thorough, well thought out, researched, we're going to think it's pretty logical. But maybe not always. We all sort of have our own idea of what constitutes common sense or just sound reasoning. So that's the baseline. Whatever you think of as common sense and rationality or reason, that's what you want to apply to make sure that the stuff you're reading seems to be checking the logos box. And if something doesn't, that might be a reason for you to look elsewhere and maybe pass on it as a potential source. I want to move now to pathos because this one might be the most important. So pathos is literally the pathetic appeal. But again, we don't quite use the word that way. What we're really thinking about here is emotions. This is the emotional appeal. Pathos equals emotions. And we're all pretty emotional people, whether we want to admit it or not. Most people make a lot of decisions based on emotion. When asked, a lot of people will say, oh, I make decisions based on logic, rationality, and reason. But the reality is most people, not always, but often, will make decisions or arrive at conclusions based, at least in part, on emotions. But when we think about pathos, we're not just thinking about big feelings like anger, happiness, sadness, fear, and all of the different combinations that we might find. We're also thinking about values. And values are really important. Values are kind of emotional at their core because values, kind of like ethics, sort of based on this idea of what's right and what's wrong. And a lot of times we'll find that we share values with the authors that we read. Authors are often acting on shared values that they might have with their readers. Because typically people who live in the same society or the same culture generally share a lot of the same values. So this can be a way to make really good connections between text and readers, to make readers really think more closely about what's in the text or to identify more closely with a particular position or idea or argument. If you can appeal to shared values, you can often get people to listen and maybe agree with you more readily. So a lot of shared values are based on things like religion, culture, and some shared sense of like human values, because a lot of human societies have some of the same values. We think certain things are right. We think certain things are wrong. We have certain standards about treating others and, how people should behave. And values, again, they're a little bit more than just feelings, but they are emotional in nature. And they're also deeply connected with people's identity, how people think of themselves. We often define ourselves, at least in part, based on values, what we think is important, what we think is right, and what we think is wrong. So if you feel like you can tap in to some shared values with readers, with members of your audience, that's usually a good thing. It makes them feel like you're speaking their language. It makes them feel like you are similar to them in some way. You share certain ideas. You value certain things like they do. So that establishes connections, a kind of kinship. And it might make you a little bit more successful in your argumentative endeavors. So these are appeals that authors generate and create while writing. And they can do them in a lot of different ways. You can use creativity. You can use real life experiences, real life examples. But remember, these kinds of appeals come from the author. They are created by the author or the speaker. Now, let's talk about the inartistic appeals. I'll keep it brief because I've already run through most of these last week when we first started talking about evidence. I sort of gave you a preview of the inartistic appeals because I wanted you to start looking for them in the TED Talk. So we'll start again with examples, but more specifically, we can talk about anecdotal evidence, which means examples taken from your own experience, but also the experiences of others. And like I was saying last week, an anecdote is an extended example. Remember what an example really is: an individual instance or occurrence that sort of illustrates or proves a larger idea or argument. So these are individual instances or occurrences, but they're a little bit more extended. They're a little bit longer. They take a narrative form. That's what an anecdote is. A more extended example that has a lot of narrative elements like characters and a plot and some type of theme or larger message that it's supposed to convey. So, again, some of these anecdotes might come from the author themselves, their own experiences, but then they're also going to pick up anecdotes from reading, from research, from talking to other people. So some of these experiences will come from others. Some will be a little bit more internally developed. But these are just little brief stories that serve as representative examples. Good source of evidence, a good way to show that a particular idea or point is true. Remember what we said about examples last time. We like them because they're not predictive, like some types of evidence. They are things that have already happened. They are occurrences that have already occurred. So we can point back to them, they are documented, and we can use them as evidence. So we also mentioned testimonial evidence last time. I was more talking about expert opinion because we see Surowiecki use that particular strategy a lot in both of his texts. But let's expand this a little bit more and just talk about testimonials more in general. Testimonials are simply the words of other people. So there are two types that we can really look for and then later utilize ourselves. Expert opinion is one type that we like very much. We like the work of experts, the scientists, the doctors, the professors, whoever, the established authorities on the topic. We like to show that we've read them. Of course, that's going to help our ethos, but also we can use their findings, their research, some of their statements. We can use a lot of that stuff as evidence in our own work. So one type of testimonial, a very common type, and we'll see it all the time, will be expert opinion. But then we also have what we might call the eyewitness account, or other types of testimonials that come from regular people, just ordinary citizens. They might not be experts, but they were either eyewitnesses to a particular event, like whatever's being talked about, or they have some direct involvement in the topic. They have some direct first-hand experience that qualifies them to speak about it. To some extent, they have valuable knowledge or experience that they probably just acquired, over the course of their daily life. Like it happened to them or they saw it happen. So we can also use some of their words. We can quote them, or we can maybe summarize some of what they are saying in our own words. So not all testimonials will come from experts, but a lot of them will, especially if we're doing good research. But we might also be able to use the words of regular people who have some direct involvement in the topic that we are exploring. So the thing to remember about testimonials, and we'll talk more about this in a couple of weeks, really, when we start our summary, paraphrase, and quotation unit, but you have a lot of different options when it comes to presenting the words of others. A lot of students like to quote. Direct quotes can be rather effective, but we don't want to quote too much. And again, I'll talk about this more later, but sometimes it's better to summarize. or paraphrase. Repetitive quotations can become a little bit difficult on readers, especially if the language is difficult. So often it's going to be important that we translate some difficult language, some complicated ideas into our own words, our own sentences. So that means we'll be summarizing, maybe paraphrasing, and the words will be ours, but the ideas are coming from our experts or our eyewitnesses or whoever it is that we're getting the testimonial from. So we're going to work on that a lot more because there are specific skills that we need to develop when we are summarizing versus paraphrasing versus quoting. Those are all things that we're going to learn more about. We'll get more comfortable doing those things very soon. All right, and then we also talked about numerical evidence last week. So just using statistics, measurements, any kind of numerical data, even dates and times. Most of this stuff will have been established as true. A lot of it's coming from research. It's coming from other people's work, articles that you read, book chapters that you read. So these numbers can often support whatever argument you're making. And that's how authors often use them. They're just really good pieces of evidence, but they have to be framed. They have to be explained in a clear and effective fashion. So having the raw data is great, but you also need to pay attention to how authors present the data. And of course, ask yourself, do you understand the data? Are they explaining it? Are they providing a context for it? Are they giving you enough for you to understand the significance of those numbers? Because the numbers don't do very much unless the reader understands what they're supposed to do and what they're supposed to say, what they're supposed to prove. So look for that as a reader because that will be very important later when you're operating as the writer. You can't just throw numbers at us. Sometimes you'll have to explain some of those numbers. It's the same with testimonials. Other people's words are not always going to immediately make sense to a reader because that reader has not read the same sources that you've read. They haven't read the sources where you got the statistics or where you got the testimonials. So they're getting that information at a secondhand remove, right? They're not getting it directly from the source like you are. They're getting it from you. So when that's the case, you have to do some things as the author to help your audience fully understand the stuff from sources that they didn't read, the stuff that they're seeing for the first time. So that's important, and that's something to really monitor when you're reading sources. How well are the authors explaining the evidence? How well are the authors presenting it so that all that stuff is accessible and easy for the readers to understand? And then we have graphical evidence is one that I haven't mentioned yet, but we'll definitely see examples of it. Graphical evidence is just really any image, chart, or diagram that can be used to support an argument. But just like stats, just like testimonials, you often have to frame and explain the graphics. Right? They're not always going to immediately make sense to somebody who's not well versed in the subject matter. But often if you're reading like science journals, stuff involving healthcare or really any sort of technological field, you're going to get a lot of graphical evidence, whereas other subject matters might not lend themselves as much to charts and graphs. But you'll see a lot of these, and you can use some of these later as well. Okay, so I want to mention the 3 sample sources that I posted for this week. I'm not going to tell you all about them because I want you to read them and experience them for yourselves. And of course, we are continuing to practice our active reading strategies. So as you read those 3 sources, underline stuff, highlight stuff, take notes, no matter how you're doing it. If you're taking notes directly on the PDF, great. If you don't have the ability to do that, you can just take notes on a separate sheet of paper. That can be by hand, that can be a Word doc, whatever you want. just as long as you're writing stuff down, creating that written record that will help you to both remember and understand the sources. So I just wanted to run through these because they're all about the same topic, but there are three different types of sources, and they're the three, I would say, that are going to be the most common for us once we start doing research of our own. So these are three different types of periodicals. So the kind of research that we do in this class largely centers around periodicals. That just means articles from publications that come out periodically. Maybe once a week, maybe every day, maybe once a month, maybe twice a year. It depends. But when we talk about periodicals, we're mostly talking about four different things. Articles that come from four different places. Academic journals, and I've mentioned these before, and we're going to see an example right off the bat with sample source number 1. Academic journals are highly specialized. They're usually, the articles in academic journals are normally written by experts, scientists, professors, experts in the field. And like I was saying, they're usually intended for a specialized audience consisting of people who work in that field or advanced college students who might be going into that field in the future. So the first example comes from an academic journal. That's perhaps our favorite kind of periodical because they are peer-reviewed. All articles in academic journals get peer-reviewed before they're published. That means other experts read them, sort of vet them, make sure they're accurate, make sure they're working well before they get published in the journal. All right, so that's one type of periodical. Then we have newspaper articles. Those are pretty easy to recognize. We've all seen newspaper articles. Nobody reads old-fashioned hard copy newspapers anymore. I guess some people do. But for most of us, if we're looking at newspapers, we're probably looking at the newspaper's website. And that's fine. That's where I got this week's newspaper article. So we can always use stuff from newspapers. Also, news magazines. That's the third type of periodical that we should be aware of. Not just any magazine. Now, depending on your topic, you might be able to utilize some other popular interest magazines that might center around sports or fashion or things like that. But generally, we're going to use articles from news magazines. Similar to newspaper articles, but usually a little bit longer, different in style, a little bit more in-depth, but not as complex, not as in-depth as those academic journal articles. And then finally, we have websites. And again, a lot of what we're dealing with on websites will be newspaper or magazine articles, and we're just reading them on the publication's website, as opposed to 50 years ago when we would have the newspaper or we'd have the magazine in our hands. In other cases, you might find academic journal articles on websites, particularly on EDU websites. Sometimes we like this because that can be an easy way to access the article, and in some cases, you might even get like an abbreviated version of the article, and you might even get some explanation that goes along with it, because these EDU websites will often be created by professors, their students, particular departments in a school, and they sometimes will have academic articles available on their sites as well. So those are the four places we're going to find most of our periodicals, most of our articles. And these will comprise most, not all, but most of our sources. So I wanted to give you three common examples to kind of get you ready for the type of stuff you're going to be reading on your own pretty soon. So like I said, the first example, the first sample source is an academic journal article. Notice that all three articles are about California wildfires. That might not be a topic that interests you. That might not be something that you could imagine writing about yourself. but that's okay. You can still read these. They're not terribly difficult. And even though they're all about the same topic, let's notice how different they are in terms of their construction, their tone, their language, their intended audience, and almost everything else. So this first one comes from the International Journal of Wildland Fire, which is an academic journal. Okay, if you read some of the author info and some of the sort of publication info that's provided in that PDF, you'll see that the journal is published out of, I believe, UC San Diego. Is the institution. So a lot of the people involved, like editing for the journal, maybe writing for the journal, work for that school. So these are academics, professors, also scientists, and they are writing a very scientific article. It's not going to be the most fun you've ever had reading something. It's going to be difficult at times. You might find their language, their structure a little bit difficult, but you can get through it. I took mercy on you guys and chose a relatively short academic journal article. It's only about 11 or 12 pages. A lot of them will be 20 pages or more. So this one's pretty short and I think pretty accessible. You just have to give it some time and work your way through it. They make a lot of use of graphical evidence, so you will get some charts and graphs, but make sure you understand what they're showing you in those charts and graphs. And still try to identify some of those advanced annotation elements. What is the argument? Who is their audience? Well, I've already told you that. It's advanced college students, people who work in the field, but also think about what their intention might be. Think about what kinds of evidence they're using. Some of it will be very obvious. You might not think you're seeing a lot of artistic appeals in that scientific article, but you might. At the very least, ethos is at work. You can certainly think about the credibility of the authors, even if you don't think they're using a lot of emotion. Maybe they're using logic. Maybe it's heavy on logos, light on pathos. But those are observations you can make. The second sample source is a newspaper article from the Las Vegas Review-Journal. So one of the biggest newspapers we have in Nevada. You'll notice how different it is. It sounds different. It looks different. The angle that the author is taking on the topic is different. And that makes sense, right? Because we have a completely different type of source here. A newspaper article written by a journalist, in particular a real estate journalist. So just like Surowiecki's background was as a financial journalist, the guy writing the second source, his background is more reporting on the real estate market, which makes sense when you look at the article and when you see what the article is really talking about. So it's much shorter than the academic journal article. We see that right away. It's easier to read. The tone, structure, language, all of it's quite different. I would also say he's using different kinds of evidence. But one thing we might notice as a similarity is that both authors, well, there's multiple authors for number one, but then for number two, for the authors in both number one and number two, they're maintaining a pretty objective, sort of detached position, right? They're not overtly using a ton of emotion, although you might find places where they could be doing it in a more subtle way. But they're trying to largely present information. There's still arguments being made, but they're presenting information in a fairly neutral, objective manner. They still have a purpose, they still have an argument, they're still using evidence, but just in terms of how the authors are presenting themselves. The authors are leaning heavily on what might be regarded as facts, hard evidence, the inartistic appeals. Again, when we say hard evidence, we usually mean inartistic appeals. The stats, the testimonials, the graphical evidence, all of that stuff that largely gets found through research, or if you're a journalist, maybe you're calling people up, conducting interviews. That's a great way to generate testimonials. So we see all of that. They're not really inserting themselves. The authors are not really inserting themselves, or sort of making a super strong emotional appeal to readers. But that's very much the case with number 3. When we get to our third sample source, that comes from a news magazine, The Atlantic, written by a staff writer from that magazine. It's also about the fires, the recent fires in California, but notice that the author is doing something very different in number 3 compared to what we saw in numbers 1 and 2. She's taking a much more personal approach. She's very much a character in her own article. She talks about herself. She talks about friends of hers. She talks about people she knows. She mentions her husband at one point. Very different approach, very different style, different tone than what we see in number 1 or number 2. So in number 3, our author is a journalist, but she's writing for a news magazine, and she's writing what might be called more long-form journalism. It's more personal. She is still reporting on certain things that are happening, but she's doing more than that. She's making a larger argument in that article, in number 3. And it's very much an argument. Not everybody is going to agree with it, but she has an angle, she has a position, but look at how she develops it. It's very much like literature. It reads very much like a short story. She's one of these journalists who is a bit more literary. The guy working for the Las Vegas paper, not super literary. He's more of a traditional hard news, keep it brief, keep it straightforward kind of journalist. What we have in number 3 is different. Still journalism, but it's a different kind. It's more literary, it's longer, it's more complex. And when I say literary, I just mean it really is a well-developed narrative. There are characters. There's a specific setting. She's not just talking about the fires in general. She's talking about the fires in one particular place, a particular neighborhood of Los Angeles. I mean, she refers to it as a town, but I think it might just be a part of the larger city. But it's got its own character. It's got its own name. It's got its own history. And she's talking about that place and the people who live there. She has a personal connection to it. So it's a very different style. It's a very different reading experience as a result. She's really crafting a highly personalized narrative about a particular place and how it's been affected by the wildfires. So some stuff will be, a common thread through all 3, but you should notice a lot of differences between these 3 sources. And the news magazine article is longer than the newspaper article, but not quite as long as the academic journal article. So we have a nice balance. The newspaper piece is short. The science journal piece will be a bit more difficult. And then in the middle, we have the piece from The Atlantic, which I think some of us might enjoy reading just because it's well written. Whether you agree with the argument or not, it's just well done. It's compelling. It's dramatic. It has a lot of those kinds of traits that the first 2 don't. But you might also notice that there's less in the way of inartistic appeals in number 3. She's definitely using a lot of artistic appeals. You're going to find pathos, a lot more of it in number 3. And I think she's using logic and ethos as well. But maybe she's not using as much from the inartistic world. But you can still notice at least a couple of examples of inartistic appeals or hard evidence that she does bring in. But she's definitely not relying as much on statistics. She's not relying as much on testimonials as numbers 1 and 2. But she has her own way of making the argument, a more personal, more artistic appeal kind of way. So navigate some of those differences. You can also point out similarities, but I want you to read all 3. You'll have a preference. You'll have the one that you like best or the one that's easiest to get through. That's fine. But experience all 3. Don't shortchange yourself by skipping one. Read all 3 so you get the full range of the kinds of sources we're going to be using. And then I have some exercises for you guys to do in this week's research journal, a chance to respond to the 3 texts. And this will kind of be the last time for a while, maybe forever, that I give you stuff to read and then you have to talk about it in the research journal. In a couple of weeks, you'll have sources of your own. So week 4, next week, we're going to start talking more about research topics. We are going to choose our research topics and we're going to get moving on research of our own. So obviously, your number one thing for this week is doing Research Journal 3 and completing all of this reading. But if you have some time at the end of the week, think about a potential research topic. Doesn't have to be a strictly academic thing. You can start with an interest. You can start with something that might even be a hobby, something that you know about, something that you do, and we can perhaps find a way for you to eventually make an argument about it. But we start with topics. The arguments come later. So by the end of next week, we need to have topics that we can start researching. And I'll talk more about choosing topics in next week's lecture. So if you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, I will see you next week.